July 1944, somewhere in northern France. General George S. Patton stood alone inside his command caravan, the low hum of distant artillery vibrating through the metal walls like a warning from the earth itself. The Normandy campaign was entering a new phase, one where mistakes would no longer cost yards. They would cost entire divisions. Patton wasn't reading reports from his own Third Army that morning. Instead, spread across his desk were situation maps from another sector entirely, a Canadian-held front that had become strangely quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that experienced commanders feared more than gunfire. For the past 48 hours, German units opposite the Canadian lines had stopped launching probing attacks. Recon patrols sent forward at night weren't coming back with the usual stories of machine gun nests and artillery traps. They came back confused. Empty trenches, abandoned forward posts, entire defensive positions that had simply vanished. At first, Patton assumed it was another deception attempt. The Wehrmacht had mastered the art of tactical withdrawal, pulling Allied forces into traps disguised as retreats. But this was different. Canadian infantry units weren't advancing recklessly. They weren't celebrating. They were digging deeper, fortifying positions, preparing for something that hadn't happened yet. And that was when Patton requested intelligence intercepts from 1st Canadian Army operations. He didn't go through official channels. He didn't want Montgomery asking questions. Late that evening, a folder arrived at his desk, stamped with clearance markings that technically meant he shouldn't even be reading it. Inside were translated German field communications. One line appeared again and again. Avoid engagement with Canadian assault units whenever possible. Another, request redeployment away from Canadian sector immediately. And then one final message that made Patton stop reading entirely. They do not withdraw once committed. That night, Patton began writing a private letter to General Dwight Eisenhower. Not an official report, not a strategic recommendation, a personal observation, one that would never appear in war briefings or press releases. Letter extract, July 18, 1944. I have commanded American troops across multiple theaters, and I say this without hesitation. The formations currently operating under Canadian command exhibit a level of battlefield persistence that exceeds anything our intelligence assessments predicted. German units are not repositioning because of terrain or supply concerns. They are relocating because they are choosing not to fight them. Patton paused before finishing the final line. He knew what he was about to write would raise questions. Questions about coordination, about leadership, about why enemy commanders seemed more concerned with avoiding Canadian infantry than American armored divisions. But he wrote it anyway. If current trends continue, the Canadian front may soon become the most strategically disruptive sector in the entire Normandy campaign. He signed it, sealed it, and marked it private. What Eisenhower would read next was never intended for the public. 2 days later, inside Allied headquarters, the letter arrived. It did not pass through public records. It was not stamped for strategic review, and it was never attached to any operational briefing. General Dwight Eisenhower received it personally. At first, he assumed it was another armored movement recommendation from Patton, likely a request for expanded maneuver clearance or logistical priority for Third Army spearheads pushing toward the Seine. But, as he read the first paragraph, he realized immediately. This was not about tanks. This was about infantry, Canadian infantry. Patton wasn't reporting losses. He wasn't requesting reinforcement. He was documenting behavior, enemy behavior. Intercepted communications from German field commands indicated something deeply unusual. Frontline units assigned opposite Canadian assault formations were requesting immediate redeployment before engagements had even begun, not after casualties. Not after failed counterattacks, before contact. Entire companies were citing unsustainable resistance expectations in posturing reports, a phrase Eisenhower had never seen used to describe infantry formations before. Normally, such terminology was reserved for mechanized breakthroughs or heavy artillery zones, but here it was being applied to Canadian rifle battalions. A second intercept included a command note from a German regimental operations officer. Recommend sector transfer. Canadian forces advance without disengagement even under indirect fire saturation. Eisenhower read it twice. Then again. He had commanded multinational forces long enough to recognize exaggeration in battlefield reports. Enemy units often dramatized threats to justify withdrawal or repositioning. But this wasn't dramatization. This was consistency. Multiple sectors, multiple commands, same language. Canadian assault formations were not probing. They were committing. And once committed, they were not pulling back. Even when artillery began falling behind them, even when flanking resistance reappeared, even when forward units became isolated. Patton's final observation was underlined in pen. Enemy tactical doctrine assumes eventual withdrawal under sustained fire. Canadian units appear not to operate under this assumption. Eisenhower leaned back in his chair. Outside, Allied aircraft roared across the French sky toward targets beyond Caen. The campaign was entering a decisive phase, and for the first time, intelligence suggested that one sector of the Allied line was beginning to alter German deployment patterns not through speed, but through refusal to stop. If German commanders began shifting divisions simply to avoid Canadian-held fronts, it would create pressure gaps elsewhere, gaps that armored units could exploit without direct resistance. But it also meant something else. The Canadians were absorbing the weight of enemy hesitation, and that kind of pressure rarely went unnoticed for long. Eisenhower folded the letter. He didn't file it. Instead, he sent a short response back to Patton. Marked, personal. 2 days later, inside Allied headquarters, the letter arrived. It did not pass through public records. It was not stamped for strategic review, and it was never attached to any operational briefing. General Dwight Eisenhower received it personally. At first, he assumed it was another armored movement recommendation from Patton, likely a request for expanded maneuver clearance or logistical priority for Third Army spearheads pushing toward the Seine. But, as he read the first paragraph, he realized immediately. This was not about tanks. This was about infantry, Canadian infantry. Patton wasn't reporting losses. He wasn't requesting reinforcement. He was documenting behavior, enemy behavior. Intercepted communications from German field commands indicated something deeply